Wanted fugitive pulls a gun on a royal guard. What happens next will leave you speechless. Crowds had gathered outside the grand gates, and the sound of chatter and excitement filled the air. Children held the hands of their parents, pointing at the shining banners and flags waving in the gentle wind. The palace itself looked majestic under the sunlight, its walls gleaming white and golden domes glinting like stars. Guards in polished uniforms stood at every corner, their faces serious, eyes scanning the crowd for any signs of trouble. It was a day meant for celebration, yet amid the joy there was tension, though the public could not see it. In a dark alley not far from the palace, a man moved cautiously, blending into the shadows. He was known to the authorities across the region. Wanted for multiple crimes, his face was familiar on posters in every police station. His name was whispered in fear and frustration by those who had tried to catch him before. This fugitive was clever and quick, always finding a way to slip through even the tightest security. But today he was tired. He had been running for days, sleeping in abandoned warehouses and hiding from authorities in the dead of night. Every sound seemed louder, every shadow darker, yet desperation pushed him forward. As he moved closer to the palace, he could hear the distant hum of the crowd, the faint notes of music played by a royal orchestra, and the occasional cheer when a notable guest arrived. The fugitive paused behind a row of trees lining the palace grounds, taking a moment to assess his options. He needed a place to hide, a way to escape without being caught. But in his mind there was only one thought: freedom. He could not go back to prison, not after everything he had endured. He swallowed hard and took a deep breath. The palace gates, which seemed so secure from the outside, now represented his only chance to disappear among the crowd. Blending in was difficult. The fugitive's clothes were worn, dusty from days of travel, and his shoes carried the marks of miles walked in a hurry. Every step he took required caution. The royal guards were alert and experienced. They knew how to spot strangers acting suspiciously. He slowed his pace, keeping to the edges of the crowd. He watched families laughing and taking photos, couples waving to the arriving guests, and children playing with small flags. He had to move carefully, pretending to be just another visitor enjoying the event. Every heartbeat felt loud, echoing in his ears. Inside the palace grounds, guards patrolled in pairs. Each of them carried communication devices, alert for any unusual activity. Their training was thorough, and they had faced many challenging situations before, though never exactly like this. They moved with confidence, their eyes sharp, scanning every face, every movement. Among the guards was a young officer, new to his role but well-trained, named Daniel. He had studied every possible emergency scenario during his months of preparation. Daniel was attentive, noticing the smallest details that others might overlook. And today, his instincts would soon be put to the test. The fugitive crept closer to the palace gates, his eyes constantly shifting to avoid detection. He noticed that security was tight near the main entrance, so he opted for a side pathway that led through the gardens. The gardens were beautiful, full of flowering plants, well-manicured lawns, and fountains that sparkled in the sun. Visitors strolled along the stone paths, taking photographs, oblivious to the danger that lurked nearby. The fugitive kept low, ducking behind bushes and statues whenever he saw a guard looking in his direction. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost like a cat stalking through a quiet forest. As he moved through the gardens, the fugitive noticed a group of children playing near a fountain. Their laughter was a sharp contrast to his anxiety, reminding him of a life that seemed impossible to reach. For a brief moment, he almost considered turning back, finding a safe place to hide until nightfall. But the thought of surrendering was unbearable. Years of running, of avoiding capture, had built in him a stubborn will to survive at all costs. He adjusted the strap of his bag, which contained essentials he had carried for his escape, some clothes, a map, and a small amount of cash. Suddenly, he heard a voice calling out. A guard, moving along the pathway, had noticed something unusual. The guard's voice was calm but firm, asking a question to an elderly visitor nearby. The fugitive froze, his heart pounding. He had almost been seen. Instinctively, he ducked behind a large stone statue of a lion, pressing himself against its cool surface. From his hiding spot, he watched as the guard's eyes scanned the garden, moving back and forth with methodical precision. The guard paused, then moved along, unaware of how close he had come to spotting the fugitive. The man exhaled slowly, relief washing over him like cold water, but the sense of relief was short-lived. The fugitive realized that he was not far from the main event area now. More guards were nearby, and he needed a plan, fast. He had to act decisively, or his freedom would end here. His mind raced, thinking of every escape route, every possible hiding place. He saw the edge of the crowd near the main plaza and decided it was his only chance. If he could blend in with the guests and slip into the palace itself, the guards might lose track of him. His movements became quicker, yet still careful, as he made his way toward the gathering crowd. As he approached, a young royal guard named Daniel spotted him. Daniel had been trained to notice behavior, not just appearances. The fugitive's movements were unusual, too cautious, too calculated. Something about him seemed off. Daniel's eyes followed the man as he moved closer to the center of the plaza. He signaled quietly to a nearby colleague, keeping his voice low to avoid alarming the crowd. But before anyone could intervene, the fugitive made a bold, desperate move. He pulled something from his bag, a small, metallic object, and raised it quickly. It was a gun glinting in the sunlight. Time seemed to slow for a moment. The crowd noticed the sudden action and froze. Children stopped laughing, parents instinctively shielded their kids, and whispers of fear spread like wildfire. The fugitive's eyes darted around, calculating, searching for a clear path. Daniel's training took over. He did not panic, though his heart raced. His voice was steady as he commanded the man to put down the weapon. Every word was deliberate, meant to reach the fugitive's mind and calm him down. The fugitive hesitated, his finger on the trigger. The crowd had begun to scatter, creating chaos around him. But Daniel remained composed, moving slowly toward him, keeping the distance necessary to avoid immediate danger while positioning himself between the fugitive and innocent bystanders. The fugitive's breathing became heavy, sweat forming on his forehead. He had not expected someone to respond with such calm confidence. Panic mingled with fear, and for the first time he realized the situation was far more dangerous than he had imagined. For several tense seconds, neither man moved closer nor retreated. All eyes were on them. The fugitive's hand shook, the gun wobbling slightly. He had been running from the law for days, always relying on speed and stealth, but now, faced with a trained guard standing firm, his options were narrowing. The garden, the fountain, and the crowd all felt suffocating. He could sense the attention of the other guards, the approaching footsteps of those who were quietly positioning themselves. His mind raced, trying to find an escape, yet every choice seemed blocked. Then something unexpected happened. A small child ran ahead, perhaps separated from their parent, and the fugitive froze. His eyes followed the child, realizing that a single wrong move could endanger an innocent life. The weight of the situation pressed on him. For the first time, he felt a pang of regret, a realization that his desperate actions had consequences beyond his own freedom. Daniel noticed this moment, the slight hesitation in the fugitive's expression, and he spoke again, calmly, reassuringly, urging him to consider surrender. The crowd continued to scatter, some people hiding behind trees or statues, others moving toward the palace gates. The fugitive's focus shifted between the guard and the chaos around him. He knew that firing the gun would only escalate the situation, and he could lose his chance to survive altogether. But the thought of giving up, of returning to a life of confinement, weighed heavily on him. His body tensed, his mind torn between fear and instinct. In that critical moment, the young guard Daniel remained a pillar of composure. He did not shout, did not make sudden movements, but his presence was commanding. Every step, every word was measured, guiding the fugitive toward a decision that could save lives, including his own. And as the seconds stretched, the fugitive began to realize the impossibility of escape through violence. His eyes flickered over the crowd, noticing families, children, and officials, all now aware of his desperate act. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the fugitive's grip on the gun loosened slightly. His shoulders slumped, the tension in his body easing, though the fear still lingered. He was cornered, trapped not by physical barriers alone, but by the awareness that any rash action could have catastrophic consequences. Daniel continued speaking softly, assuring him that surrendering was the only way to survive and avoid harming others. The fugitive's decision hung in the air, balancing between desperation and reason. He glanced around one last time, his eyes meeting Daniel's steady gaze. Somewhere deep inside, He knew that the path he was about to take would change his life forever. And in that moment, the story of his desperate flight, his cunning escapes, and his attempts to avoid capture all culminated in the tense pause that defined the day. The square around the royal palace had turned into a swirl of chaos. People shouted and moved quickly, trying to get out of the way of the man holding the gun. Some stumbled over steps or bumped into each other, while others froze, unable to take their eyes off the unfolding drama. Children clung tightly to their parents, crying or whispering questions that went unanswered. The atmosphere, which had been festive only moments ago, was now tense and frightening. The bright sunlight reflected off the palace walls, but it did nothing to lighten the fear gripping the crowd. The fugitive's pulse raced. His hands trembled slightly, but his mind worked frantically, scanning for an escape route. He realized that the palace's open space, which he had hoped would give him room to move, was now a trap. Every step he considered was blocked by fleeing people, uniformed guards, or the palace's decorative barriers. Panic rose in his chest. This was unlike anything he had faced before. Usually he had the advantage of secrecy and darkness. Today, the world was bright, open, and full of eyes that could see every move he made. Daniel, the young royal guard, continued to move carefully but steadily toward the fugitive. His voice remained calm but firm, calling out instructions for the man to put the gun down. "You don't need to do this. You can surrender and nobody will get hurt," he said. His tone was deliberate, measured to reach the fugitive's mind to slow the rush of fear and desperation. Daniel had learned in training that panic could escalate a dangerous situation quickly, so he stayed composed, using every word and movement to de-escalate the tension. The fugitive's eyes darted from Daniel to the crowd, then to the palace gates. He realized that escape through force would be impossible. The thought of shooting crossed his mind, but he also knew the consequences. A single mistake, a single pull of the trigger could end his life instantly. And worse, innocent people could be hurt. His mind raced, trying to find a way to turn the situation in his favor, but every option seemed closed. For the first time in days, the fugitive felt the weight of his own choices pressing down on him. Around them, the crowd's panic grew. People screamed and ran, and the sound echoed against the palace walls. Daniel noticed an elderly couple struggling to move quickly enough and signaled them to step back behind a low wall. He then positioned himself between them and the fugitive, making sure no one was in the line of fire. His training kicked in automatically. Protect the innocent first, contain the threat second. Every move was precise, minimizing risk to the bystanders. Meanwhile, other guards were quietly coordinating their positions. They did not rush forward, understanding that a hasty approach could provoke the fugitive into shooting. One guard moved along the side of the plaza, unseen by the man holding the gun, preparing to block any sudden attempt to flee. Another officer stayed behind a decorative column, ready to act if the situation escalated. It was a silent dance of strategy, with each trained individual playing their part. The fugitive's breathing grew heavier. Sweat dripped down his forehead as he realized that every move he made was being anticipated. Daniel's calm presence had a strange effect. Instead of increasing fear, it made the fugitive pause, consider, and think. His eyes flickered over the guard's steady expression and disciplined posture. He had faced police before, but never someone who did not shout or make sudden movements. This was different, and for a moment, his desperation gave way to doubt. The crowd continued to react. Some people were recording the incident on their phones, whispering to friends, or trying to get to safety. The sound of distant sirens reached their ears. Additional security forces were approaching the palace. The fugitive could feel that his time was running out. Every second brought more attention, more witnesses, and more potential captors. He realized that the chances of walking away from this situation were shrinking rapidly. Daniel continued speaking, his voice steady and calm. "Look at the people around you. Do you really want to risk hurting them? We can end this safely if you make the right choice." He did not shout, did not threaten, but his words carried authority. He understood that the fugitive was not only physically trapped, but also mentally cornered. By remaining calm, Daniel gave the man a choice, one that could save lives, including his own. The fugitive's hands shook more noticeably. He adjusted his grip on the gun, almost unconsciously, as if the weapon itself was heavier than he expected. The thought of shooting became less appealing, replaced by the realization that surrendering might be his only option. He looked around and noticed the wide plaza, the fleeing crowd, and the approaching guards. Every possible route for escape seemed blocked or watched. He felt trapped, and in that trap he could no longer rely on his usual tricks or speed. For a few moments, the fugitive hesitated entirely. He stared at Daniel, who had not moved an inch, his posture calm and deliberate. The guard's eyes conveyed understanding, not hatred, and it was something the fugitive had not expected. He had anticipated anger, threats, or immediate force. Instead, he found calm and focus, an unsettling combination that made him rethink his options. Nearby, another guard created a subtle distraction. He tripped over a small stone near the fountain, falling loudly. The noise drew the fugitive's attention for a brief second. In that moment, Daniel moved slightly, positioning himself in a way that kept the fugitive contained, but also offered a clear path to safety for the crowd. It was a minor maneuver, but it demonstrated the careful coordination of the security team. Every step was calculated, designed to de-escalate the situation without endangering anyone. The fugitive's mind raced. He thought of the days he had spent running, hiding, and avoiding capture. Every plan he had made now seemed futile. He could not outrun the situation, and using the gun would only make matters worse. Fear and fatigue clouded his thoughts, yet amid the panic, he noticed small details. The calmness of Daniel, the measured movements of the other guards, the way the crowd responded to instructions. It was a pattern he had never experienced in his life of running and hiding. For several seconds, neither the fugitive nor Daniel moved closer. The plaza was alive with tension, the sound of footsteps, shouts, and the faint ringing of alarms in the distance blending together. The fugitive's grip on the gun loosened slightly. He looked around, realizing that every choice he had made in life had led him to this moment. There was no escape through violence. The only path forward was surrender. The young guard spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "It's not too late. Put the weapon down and no one will get hurt. You can walk away from this safely if you choose to do the right thing." Daniel's words were not just commands, they were a lifeline. The fugitive's mind, clouded with fear and fatigue, grasped at the chance for survival. His eyes met Daniel's, searching for some sign of mercy or understanding. And in that steady gaze, he found a small spark of hope. The crowd continued to react around them, though some were beginning to take cover behind walls and benches. Parents shielded their children, and some people whispered to one another, wondering what would happen next. The tension in the air was almost tangible. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, the situation poised on a knife's edge between disaster and resolution. Then, something remarkable happened. The fugitive lowered his weapon slightly, almost involuntarily. The tension in his body eased just a little, though his fear remained. Daniel noticed the change immediately and maintained his calm approach. He continued to speak in a steady, reassuring voice, guiding the fugitive toward surrender without rushing or threatening. Every word was designed to give the man a chance to make the right choice while keeping the crowd safe. The fugitive looked around once more. The plaza seemed impossibly large, yet every exit and path was watched or blocked. The realization that he could not escape through force weighed heavily on him. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to consider the consequences of his actions. He saw the faces of children, families, and visitors, and a sense of responsibility began to replace some of his desperation. Every move he made now could affect innocent lives. The young guard Daniel continued his careful approach, closing the distance slowly while keeping the line of sight between the fugitive and the crowd. His every movement was precise, designed to offer a clear path to safety for the public while positioning himself to prevent any sudden escalation. The fugitive's breathing grew heavy, and his trembling hands signaled that he was reaching a breaking point. Finally, after what felt like endless moments, the fugitive's resolve began to shift. He realized that continuing to hold the gun would only make things worse. He was cornered, mentally and physically, and the only chance to avoid tragedy was to follow Daniel's guidance. The spark of hope offered by the guard's calm demeanor became a lifeline, showing him a way out of the chaos without harming anyone. The plaza was still tense, but a subtle change occurred. The fugitive's eyes flickered between Daniel, the approaching guards, and the fleeing crowd. He made a small, almost imperceptible movement, lowering the gun slightly more. Daniel kept his calm voice steady, encouraging the man to put it down completely. Around them, the crowd's fear remained, but there was a growing sense of relief that the situation might be resolved safely. The plaza had grown quiet, but the tension was far from gone. The crowd, though still frightened, had taken cover behind walls, benches, and decorative pillars. Parents shielded their children, whispering reassurances that barely reached their ears. Some people dared to peek from behind corners, their eyes wide, watching the unfolding drama. The bright sunlight cast long shadows across the stone floor, adding to the intensity of the scene. Every movement, every sound felt amplified, as if the world had shrunk to focus entirely on the fugitive, the gun, and the young guard standing between him and chaos. The fugitive's heart raced. His pulse thundered in his ears and sweat streamed down his face. The gun felt heavy in his hands, almost as if it were a symbol of the impossible choices he had made throughout his life. He had been running for days, evading the authorities, avoiding capture, and living in a constant state of fear. Yet nothing he had faced compared to this moment, where the lives of strangers, the safety of a public event, and his own survival hung in a delicate balance. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, to fire, to do something, anything, to regain control, but he knew deep down that any rash action could end in disaster. Daniel, the young guard, maintained his calm. His eyes never left the fugitive, and his body remained composed yet ready. He had been trained for situations like this, but this was no drill, no simulation. It was real, and the stakes were higher than anything he had imagined. Every word he spoke was deliberate, carefully chosen to reach the fugitive's mind and reduce the panic that could push him toward violence. "You don't have to do this. Nobody wants to see anyone get hurt. Put the gun down and we can resolve this safely," he said, his tone steady, almost soothing. The fugitive's eyes flicked to Daniel and then to the crowd. Families huddled together, faces pale with fear. Children clutched stuffed toys or small flags, looking up at their parents for protection. The fugitive's gaze lingered on one young girl, no more than 7 years old, whose wide eyes seemed to plead silently for safety. In that instant, the weight of his actions pressed down on him like never before. The gun, once a tool of escape, now felt like a burden too heavy to carry. He realized that any sudden movement could cause harm, and the thought made him hesitate. Around them, the palace guards moved with precision. They did not rush in, understanding that a misstep could provoke the fugitive. Instead, they positioned themselves strategically, creating a cordon that limited his possible movements. One officer quietly moved behind a decorative fountain, ready to act if the situation escalated, while another stayed near the side pathway, prepared to block an escape attempt. It was a delicate dance of patience, skill, and timing. Every officer knew that rushing in could turn a dangerous situation into a tragic one. The fugitive's breathing became more ragged. His hands shook as he adjusted his grip on the gun, realizing that the moment of truth had arrived. He had run from authorities countless times before, but this was different. The open space, the watchful eyes, and the calm authority of Daniel created a pressure he could not escape. He was trapped not just physically but mentally, forced to confront the consequences of his desperate actions. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to consider surrender. Daniel continued speaking, his voice calm and measured. "You can choose to end this safely. You can walk away without anyone getting hurt, including yourself. Put the gun down, make the right choice." His words were not just commands. They were lifelines, threads connecting the fugitive to a possibility of survival. The young guard knew that panic could escalate in a fraction of a second, and he had to maintain this fragile balance until the man made his decision. The fugitive's mind raced through his life's choices, the moments of fear, the risks taken, and the long nights spent hiding from the law. He thought of the people he had avoided harming, the families he had left untouched, and the chances he had squandered. Now, faced with a situation where one decision could determine the fate of many, he felt the crushing weight of responsibility. The gun in his hands no longer felt like a tool of power, but a dangerous extension of his desperation. Around them, the crowd remained tense, but increasingly aware that the situation might be resolved without tragedy. Some whispers of hope spread among the bystanders. People watched as the fugitive's posture shifted, his body language betraying the inner conflict. He lowered the gun slightly, then raised it again in hesitation. Every subtle movement was noticed by Daniel, who adjusted his position accordingly, keeping the path between the fugitive and the crowd secure. The young guard's training emphasized patience, and now it paid off. He did not move too quickly, which could provoke the fugitive, nor did he speak harshly, which could escalate fear. Instead, he maintained a steady presence, using calm words and deliberate gestures to guide the man toward surrender. "You can end this now," Daniel said softly, his tone filled with understanding rather than accusation. "It's not too late to do the right thing. You can survive this, and no one else needs to be hurt." The fugitive's eyes darted to the approaching sound of sirens. More security personnel were arriving, and he realized that the space for escape was shrinking by the second. Every option he had imagined in his mind seemed blocked, every route leading only to danger. The weight of the situation pressed on him like a physical force. He felt trapped, isolated, and vulnerable. His finger trembled on the trigger, but something inside him urged him to reconsider. For several long seconds, the world seemed to pause. The crowd held its breath, the palace guards remained poised, and the fugitive wrestled with the decision that would define the next moments of his life. He looked around again, noticing families, the young girl, and the expressions of fear and hope all around him. The realization hit him hard. Violence would solve nothing. It would only endanger lives and seal his fate. The gun in his hand felt impossibly heavy now, a symbol of the mistakes that had brought him to this point. Daniel noticed the shift in the fugitive's demeanor. His body language softened slightly, the tension in his shoulders easing. The gun, still held tightly, lowered a fraction. Daniel continued to speak in calm, measured tones. "You can put it down. No one will hurt you if you surrender. Take this chance. End this safely." His words reached the fugitive's mind not as commands, but as an opportunity, a final chance to make the right choice. The fugitive's gaze moved back and forth, from Daniel to the crowd, to the approaching guards, and then back again. He realized that the path forward was no longer about running or fighting. It was about surrender. Every fiber of his being screamed in protest, urging him to resist, to flee, to escape the consequences of his actions. But reason, long buried under fear and desperation, began to surface. He knew that any rash movement could have disastrous consequences. He knew that the only way to survive and protect others was to put the gun down. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the fugitive began to lower the weapon further. His hands trembled violently, but he made the effort to comply. Daniel remained calm, maintaining his position and offering reassuring words, guiding the man gently toward the correct choice. The crowd, though still tense, began to sense that the situation might be resolved peacefully. Whispers of relief spread as the fugitive's posture shifted from aggression to hesitation, from fear to cautious acceptance. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the fugitive's shoulders slumped. The gun, once raised defiantly, now pointed toward the ground. Daniel's voice remained calm, encouraging but firm. "That's it. Put it down completely. Nobody will get hurt if you follow my instructions." The man's hands shook as he complied, setting the weapon carefully on the ground, ensuring no sudden movements that could provoke a reaction from the guards. The tension in the plaza began to ease. The crowd, sensing the shift, started to relax slightly, though cautious eyes remained fixed on the unfolding scene. The fugitive, still breathing heavily, was aware that he was no longer in control of the situation. He had surrendered not just to Daniel and the palace guards, but to the reality of the moment. The weight of the decision pressed on him, but there was also a sense of relief, a fragile hope that he could survive without tragedy. Daniel maintained his calm presence until additional officers reached the plaza. They moved in carefully, securing the area while ensuring the fugitive remained unharmed. The man was gently but firmly restrained, his hands secured behind his back. The young guard's patience, training, and composure had prevented a disaster, guiding the fugitive to make the right choice. As the additional guards escorted the man away, the crowd began to breathe more freely. Some people clapped softly, others whispered words of gratitude for the calm and skill displayed by the palace security team. Families reunited with their children, and the plaza slowly returned to a sense of order. The bright sunlight now felt less harsh, and the tension that had gripped the area began to dissolve. The fugitive, walking between the guards, was silent. His eyes reflected a mixture of fear, exhaustion, and the dawning realization of what he had avoided. He had survived a dangerous situation not through force or cunning, but by making a single, critical choice. Daniel, still alert, followed the procession, ensuring that everything remained secure until the man was fully in custody. In the aftermath, witnesses would later describe the scene as tense, chaotic, and yet remarkably controlled. The young guard's calm demeanor, precise actions, and patient guidance had turned what could have been a tragedy into a story of human courage, quick thinking, and the power of remaining composed under pressure. For the fugitive, it was a turning point, a moment that would shape the rest of his life. The plaza slowly began to calm, though the echoes of fear and tension still lingered in the air. Families held their children tightly, speaking in hushed tones and some whispered prayers of relief. The bright sunlight no longer seemed merely decorative. It reflected off the stone floors and palace walls, highlighting the aftermath of what could have been a catastrophe. The crowd was safe, but everyone could feel the weight of what had just transpired. This was not a moment easily forgotten. The fugitive, now escorted by the palace guards, walked with his hands restrained behind him. His head hung low, and his clothes, once covered in dust and sweat from days of running, clung to him uncomfortably in the warm afternoon sun. He had made a decision that changed everything. He had surrendered voluntarily, and though he knew he would face justice, he also knew that lives had been spared because of that choice. It was a heavy realization. For the first time in many days, he felt a strange mixture of relief and fear. Relief because the immediate danger had passed, and fear because his freedom, long sought, was now gone. Daniel, the young guard who had handled the situation with calm precision, stayed alert. His eyes scanned the plaza continuously, ensuring no further disturbances occurred. The additional guards had secured the area, and the fugitive was safely under control. But Daniel's responsibility did not end there. He needed to make sure the crowd remained calm and that the entire situation was brought to a peaceful conclusion. Every training exercise, every lesson from months of preparation, had led to this moment, and his professionalism shone through. The witnesses, still gathering themselves, began to talk quietly among themselves. Parents comforted their children, some pointing out how brave the young guard had been. Others marveled at the fact that a dangerous situation had been resolved without anyone being hurt. Cameras, once held discreetly, now captured the scene as people realized that this was something extraordinary. The media, always alert to breaking stories at the palace, started taking notes and photographs, ready to report on the event that had held everyone in suspense for what felt like hours. Inside the palace, officials and organizers were coordinating the next steps. The event had been temporarily halted, and security protocols were being reviewed immediately. They were aware that the day could have ended in tragedy, and while the situation was now under control, they needed to ensure that the safety of the palace grounds would be maintained for the remainder of the event. Officials spoke to security personnel, reviewing what had occurred, and praised the quick and disciplined response of the young guard and his colleagues. Their training had prevented what could have been a disaster, and that fact did not go unnoticed. The fugitive, walking slowly between the guards, reflected on the events of the day. He had spent years running, hiding, and avoiding capture, believing that his cleverness and agility would always keep him free. But in the bright light of the plaza, with crowds watching and a trained guard standing calmly before him, he realized that his old methods no longer worked. The decision to surrender had not been easy. Fear, pride, and desperation had all battled inside him for control, but in the end, reason and the presence of calm authority had prevailed. He had chosen life and safety over chaos and violence. Daniel, still maintaining his watchful stance, ensured that the fugitive was safely escorted to a secure area where he could be formally taken into custody. The young guard's professionalism was evident to everyone observing him. He did not celebrate or relax until the threat had been completely neutralized, understanding that any lapse could have consequences. His training and composure under pressure had made the difference, not just in securing the fugitive, but in protecting the crowd and maintaining order in a potentially explosive situation. Witnesses later recalled the details with amazement. They spoke of the calm bravery of the young guard, the skillful coordination of the palace security team, and the intense tension that had gripped the plaza moments before. Many remarked that it was remarkable how a situation that could have ended in violence was resolved peacefully. For some, it was a lesson in patience, courage, and the power of remaining calm under pressure. Others noted the fugitive's own actions, the hesitation, the eventual surrender, and the realization of responsibility that led him to make the right choice. Inside the secure area, the fugitive was questioned by the authorities. They wanted to understand his motivations, how he had evaded capture for so long, and what had led him to attempt such a bold action in a public space. The fugitive answered with a mixture of honesty and caution. He admitted his fear, his desperation, and his understanding that his actions had consequences far beyond his own life. For the first time, he faced not just the law but also the reality of the choices he had made. He understood that his freedom was no longer a matter of cunning or speed, but of accountability and consequences. Outside, the plaza slowly returned to a sense of normalcy. The crowd, though still cautious, began to move again, some taking photos, others speaking quietly about what had happened. Parents comforted children who had been frightened, explaining that brave people had kept everyone safe. The young guard Daniel, though exhausted from the intensity of the situation, continued his duties, ensuring that the remaining event could proceed without further issues. His presence reassured both the public and his colleagues, demonstrating that training and discipline could prevent chaos and maintain safety. The palace officials held a brief meeting to review the incident. They discussed what had gone well, the calm and precise response of Daniel, the coordinated positioning of the other guards, and the decision-making that allowed the fugitive to surrender safely. They also reviewed areas for improvement, understanding that every security system could benefit from continuous refinement. For Daniel, the praise was subtle but meaningful. He had followed his training, acted decisively, and ultimately prevented a tragedy that could have been remembered for all the wrong reasons. Meanwhile, the fugitive sat quietly, reflecting on what had occurred. He had expected chaos, anger, and immediate punishment. Instead, he had been met with calm authority, clear instructions, and the opportunity to make a responsible choice. That experience left a lasting impression. He realized that his life had been a series of narrow escapes and desperate decisions, but today had shown him that courage, patience, and the willingness to surrender could sometimes achieve more than running or fighting ever could. The crowd, now more relaxed, began to talk about the incident in hushed tones. Stories circulated quickly about the young guard who had maintained his composure, the fugitive who had chosen to surrender, and the dramatic tension that had held everyone captive in suspense. Social media posts began to appear, praising the bravery and professionalism displayed, highlighting the lessons of courage, responsibility, and the power of calm leadership. For many, it was a moment that would not be forgotten. As the day continued, the palace organizers allowed the event to resume. Music filled the air once more, though more subdued than before, and visitors returned to their activities with a new appreciation for the safety measures in place. The presence of trained guards, the quick thinking of young officers, and the peaceful resolution of a potentially dangerous situation reminded everyone of the importance of preparation, skill, and calmness in the face of uncertainty. The fugitive, now formally in custody, began to understand the gravity of his actions. He had acted out of fear and desperation, but he had also been given a chance to make the right choice. That moment of decision, the choice to surrender rather than escalate violence, would shape the rest of his life. It was a lesson in responsibility, in understanding that courage could manifest not only in action but in restraint. Daniel, after ensuring the plaza was secure and the crowd was safe, finally allowed himself a moment to breathe. His hands were still tense from the intensity of the situation, but he felt a quiet satisfaction. The training, preparation, and presence of mind he had demonstrated had prevented what could have been a catastrophe. For him, the event would always be remembered as a defining moment in his career, a time when calm, careful actions made the difference between disaster and safety. The palace officials formally recognized Daniel and the other guards involved for their exemplary performance. Though the recognition was official, the real reward was knowing that lives had been saved. The fugitive's surrender had prevented injury, and the crowd's safety had been maintained. The event, once shadowed by fear, had been transformed into a story of courage, professionalism, and human responsibility. As the day drew to a close, the plaza gradually emptied. Families returned home, visitors reflected on the drama they had witnessed, and the palace resumed its normal rhythm. The fugitive, escorted to further secure custody, would face the consequences of his actions. But he also carried the understanding of what it meant to make a responsible choice under pressure. Daniel, the young guard, returned to his duties with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that preparedness and calm leadership could change the outcome of even the most dangerous situations. For the public, the incident became a story of hope and inspiration. It reminded everyone that fear could be met with courage, that danger could be resolved through calm and careful action, and that even in the face of desperation, it was possible to make choices that preserved life and safety. Families recounted the story to friends, media outlets covered the heroic actions of the guards, and the fugitive's surrender became a lesson in responsibility and accountability. In the end, the events of that day left a lasting impression on all who witnessed them. The fugitive had been given a chance to act wisely. The guards had performed their duties with skill and patience, and the crowd had been protected from harm. It was a story of tension, suspense, and ultimately resolution, a reminder of the power of calm, the importance of preparation, and the difference that a single, thoughtful decision can make.